I thought this week we'd have a small chat about the small intestine. There's actually quite a lot of anatomy in there, so I thought we'd go over the salient anatomical stuff, bit of function, but we should look at the microscopic structure of the small intestine and the gross structure of the small intestine, because both are really important and they all interplay, right? It's just our eyes can't see down to the microscopic level, we can just see, so we just look at the gross, you know what I mean? We need to look at all the scales. So what's the job of the small intestine then? Well, it's digestion, isn't it? It's obviously digestion, but we've got this GI tract that runs through the body. In fact, I know why I'm talking about this, because I did an embryology lecture this week about the GI tract. And the GI tract starts off as a nice simple tube in the embryo with a bit of mesentery holding it in place, and that gets nice and complicated as it gets longer and twisted and stuff. But essentially that's what we're doing. We have a tube running through us, we pass food into it, and then as it goes down, that food gets broken down as much as it can, and the nutrients get passed into the blood supply, and we use them, and then the stuff we get rid of at the other end, right? So what's the purpose of the small intestine? Well, the stomach receives the food. We'll talk about the stomach another time, but it starts digestion, and then it squirts that partially digested, chewed up, enzymatically degradable partially into the small intestine. And the small intestine is around 5 or 6 meters long in us, which is quite impressive, isn't it? 5 or 6 meters long. And it's all coiled up and stuffed into a very small space. And it's a muscular tube, which makes sense. We'll look at the layers of muscle, because the muscle pushes the contents along the tube. But what happens in the small intestine is largely the breaking down of food into smaller components, molecules. So we're breaking down proteins, lipids and carbohydrates into nice small molecules-ish, and then we push them across the cell membranes into the blood, and off they go to the liver. So to do that, well, we're going to need some funky chemicals to help us with digestion. That's more physiology, but we should talk about that when we're looking at the anatomy, because different parts of the small intestine have different chemicals and do different things. But also there's a massive specialization of surface area, right? So if we look inside the small intestine, we see folds, plicae circularis. So these are ring folds within the small intestine, so that increases the surface area. And then if we get the microscope and we have a look at the epithelium lining the small intestine, we see that on those circular folds we then see lots of villi sticking out. And then if we go to a higher power magnification and we look at the epithelia on the villi, we see that those epithelia have further specializations of microvilli, which are increasing the surface area even more. So there's a massive increase in surface area within the small intestine to maximize absorption of stuff across the epithelium into the blood supply. Let's move these aside. Right. On this model, everything's been pulled apart a little bit so that we can see what we're looking at. But here's the stomach here, here's the last part of the stomach. Hold that, will you? Thank you. And so this is the sac of the stomach, a very recognizable shape. This is the pyloric region of the stomach, the pylorus, kind of a muscular sphincter that keeps everything here, then squirts the contents, the chyme from the stomach into the first part of the small intestine, which starts here. And the first part of the small intestine is the duodenum. So the small intestine itself has 3 regions: duodenum, ileum or ileum, and jejunum. All right? So the duodenum is the first part. The duodenum, if we take off this bit of large bowel here, here's the stomach. Now here's the duodenum here, and the duodenum is forming kind of a C shape. So it has this horizontal part, and then this descending part, and then this other horizontal part, and then it goes up a little bit and joins the next part of the small intestine, the jejunum. And this tissue here that is wrapping around, this is the pancreas. And the green line we can see here, well, up here, there's the gallbladder. We've got the biliary tree there. So the liver makes bile and it backs up and is stored in the gallbladder. But essentially that bile is passed into the duodenum through the bile duct. And look, it's meeting the main pancreatic duct here. So the pancreatic duct runs the length of the pancreas. And the bile duct, the main pancreatic duct, both enter the duodenum at the same point here. And this is during the descending part of the duodenum. So the four parts of the duodenum have a number of different names. If I describe them, then the superior part, which is going along like this, gets called the superior part. The descending part going down here gets called the descending part. And then this bit going along here horizontally gets called the horizontal part. And then this last bit of the duodenum that goes up a little bit before joining the jejunum, that gets called the ascending part of the duodenum. Put it like that, seems quite straightforward. They also get called the first, second, third and fourth parts of the duodenum, and you may see that annotated as D1, D2, D3, D4 in some places. But those are the four parts of the duodenum. The duodenum itself is about 30 centimetres long. So it's receiving the contents of the stomach, which is acidic. Now we've got some proteases in the stomach which are activated by the acidic environment. Proteases are dangerous because they degrade proteins, which is great for the stuff you're eating, but not because the proteases might degrade you as well, right? Because you're made of protein, so that would be bad. So we've got these dangerous proteases, this acidic chyme entering the duodenum. We've got bile being squeezed in here, and we also have the exocrine secretions of the pancreas being pushed into the duodenum here as well. So that means that the duodenum is a busy little area. But while we're considering this point here, where the bile duct and the pancreatic duct open into the duodenum, I'm going to throw a whole load of words at you. This opening here into the duodenum gets called the major duodenal papilla. There's a sphincter of muscle there, which I really like the name of. It's the sphincter of Oddi. I wonder if it's got a contemporary name, probably. The sphincter of Oddi then controls stuff getting squirted into the duodenum. And just before the sphincter of Oddi, so on the other side within the pancreas, is the ampulla of Vata, whose contemporary name is the hepatopancreatic ampulla. So an ampulla is like a dilated part of a tube, right? So you've got a tube, the ampulla is a dilated bit. So that's just on the other side. So that's where the bile duct and the pancreatic duct join and enter into the duodenum, right? So if that's called the major duodenal papilla, then you must be wondering, well, where's the minor duodenal papilla? Now, interestingly, most people don't have one. Okay, embryologically, the pancreas actually forms from two separate buds. Right, there are two buds, one's ventral, one's dorsal, and the stomach rotates. We've got a lot of cool rotational stuff going on, but what happens is that the ventral and dorsal pancreatic buds come around and get pushed together, form one pancreas. Each of those buds had their own duct. So here's the main duct here, and this is an accessory duct. In fact, originally this was the main duct, this was the accessory duct, and they joined together, but whatever. Normally most of us just have this single duct here. Around 9 or 10% of us have this second duct here, and it may open as a second papilla in the duodenum. So if you're doing an endoscope down the duodenum, you find these two papillae, don't panic. It's kind of a normal thing, it's just a bit unusual. So the bile includes things that help digest lipids, and then the exocrine secretions of the pancreas, which are a collection of really, really cool enzymes, also help digest lipids and carbohydrates and proteins. So this is an area where there's a lot of active stuff going on to help break down the stuff we've been eating and digest it. The pancreas also puts bicarbonates into the duodenum, and that helps neutralize the acidic stuff that the stomach is putting into the duodenum. So it's going to kind of neutralize the pH a little bit. And in fact, the duodenum also has Brunner's glands within it. And those Brunner's glands produce an alkaline mucin, like an alkaline mucus, right? Which neutralizes the acid from the stomach, protecting the duodenum, and I think it actually pushes the pH so it goes a little bit alkaline at that point. So the duodenum is a bit special because of those Brunner's glands and because of this anatomy and that sort of thing. Bit of embryology. In the embryo, we talk about foregut, midgut, and hindgut. And this is described in the embryo by we have this very simple GI tract, but the GI tract loops anteriorly and is still connected to the yolk sac in the middle. So the midgut is that loop attached to the yolk sac. The hindgut is the bit caudal to it, inferior to it. And the foregut is the bit superior to it, cranial to it, right? And this is very handy for people who are studying anatomy because there's one artery of the foregut, and that's the celiac trunk. There's one artery for the midgut, and that's the superior mesenteric artery. And there's one artery for the hindgut, and that's the inferior mesenteric artery. Those are three anterior branches from the aorta, supplying that early simple GI tract, that early simple gut tube. And as the gut tube gets more and more complicated, branches of those arteries get carried with them. Now, the point at which the foregut meets the hindgut is around this point here, around the point where the pancreas and the bile duct into the duodenum. We say above that point, so superior to that point, this is all foregut. So all of this stuff receives blood from the celiac trunk and branches of the celiac trunk, whereas the rest of the small bowel and part of the large bowel we define as midgut and receives blood from the superior mesenteric artery and branches of it. And in fact, if we look at this model of the pancreas, which has blood vessels on it, we see the celiac trunk is up here, the superior mesenteric artery is here. Look how it's coming out between the gap between the pancreas and the third part of the duodenum here. That's very, very neat. So that's where you'll find the superior mesenteric artery. And then we have a bunch of pancreatico-duodenal arteries, right, supplying the head of the pancreas and the alternate process and the duodenum. So we have these curves. So this part of the artery is coming from the celiac trunk. This part of the artery is coming from the superior mesenteric artery. So we see quite nicely here how there's an overlap of the blood supply of the foregut with the blood supply of the midgut, and that occurs then at the duodenum. Okay, so the duodenum then passes its contents into the jejunum, and the jejunum is going to be about 2/5 of the length of all the small bowel here. So this is going to be kind of the jejunum region up this side here, and it's all wiggly. If we look at the histology of the jejunum, we see again those massive adaptations to surface area, the plicae circularis, those circular folds that we saw up here, villi, microvilli, and in the jejunum we're going to see intestinal glands, also known as crypts of Lieberkühn. Right, so you've got the villi sticking up. So you've got to try and imagine like a flat surface that you're starting from, right? And then the villi are coming up from that flat surface, right? And then down into that flat surface, you've got these cylinders, right? You've got these holes, and down in those holes, those are the intestinal glands. Those are the crypts of Lieberkühn, and in there you're secreting stuff, right? So it's inside the jejunum where most of the absorption of those nutrients that we've been breaking down is occurring in the jejunum. That's its big job. And we see, so the cells there with the microvilli, so this is an epithelial cell layer, and the cells with the microvilli, those are enterocytes. And we'll also see goblet cells which are producing mucus, and we'll see Paneth cells which are producing kind of antimicrobial stuff to balance because we've got this nice balance of the right bacteria in our GI tract, right? So we've got this antimicrobial stuff controlling all that. We've got enteroendocrine cells, which are producing a whole bunch of hormones. There's a lot of physiology going on in the gut. So the enteroendocrine cells are producing hormones, which are then locally controlled, within the small bowel, controlling gut function. It's very, very cool. If we look inside the villi, we see lacteals. In a villus, there's a lacteal, a kind of bit specialised lymphatic vessel which receives some of those lipids, carries them into the lymphatic system, and then dumps them into the blood supply, where up here where the thoracic duct drains into the venous supply there, and then the lipid goes off around the body. So we've got some specialised anatomy within the jejunum, but the jejunum passes to the ileum, and it's not easy to tell where the jejunum becomes the ileum. It's kind of more of a gradual change, right? And in the ileum we see fewer plicae circularis, fewer of those circular folds. And most of the absorption has happened in the jejunum, and what's happening in the ileum is absorbing anything else that hasn't been absorbed yet, but also a bit of recycling. So bile salts are reabsorbed in the ileum and they're reused. So if you have part of your ileum removed, then you're going to have a deficiency of bile salts because you'll be losing them, they won't get recycled. Also, the terminal ileum is a region where vitamin B12 is absorbed. Vitamin B12 is important in making new erythrocytes, making new red blood cells. So if the ability to absorb vitamin B12 is impaired, then you're going to see signs of anemia. So the ileum then is going to be this part of the bowel down here, passing down towards this end, and this is where we're going to end, right? So this is ileum. And we're also going to find Peyer's patches in the ileum, which we wouldn't have found elsewhere. So Peyer's patches are patches of lymphoid tissue, right, with lymphocytes in them, parts of the immune system, so they can respond to stuff they need to respond to, doing immune system stuff in the gut. In the other parts of the small intestine you'll see lymphoid patches, but they won't be quite the same as Peyer's patches. And throughout the length of the small intestine, if we look histologically, we'll see layers of smooth muscle. So there are two layers of smooth muscle. The layer of smooth muscle closest to the lumen of the small intestine is going to be the circular layer, and then the next layer out from that is going to be a longitudinal layer. And if you think about it, the circular layer is going to squeeze stuff along the tube, the contents of the tube along it, and then the longitudinal muscle will shorten the tube. So both of those arrangements of smooth muscle are very effective at squeezing the contents of the small intestine along the small intestine. And to also help with that, the small intestine is held in place somewhat loosely by the mesentery, and there's a whole other video about the mesentery and the peritoneum if you haven't got to grips with that yet. But the small bowel can move around as it's gurgling its way along and pushing things along it, right? And within the mesentery, that's how the blood gets to the GI tract and how the blood leaves the GI tract, and also nerves and that sort of thing. So, talking about the nervous system, have you heard of the enteric nervous system of the gut? So the enteric nervous system is kind of thought of like a second brain, right? Like an independent nervous system that regulates gut function. You can do its own thing on its own. It'll regulate what's happening in the gut without any need for any higher functions. That's the enteric nervous system, running the length of the GI tract. Now, the sympathetic and parasympathetic innervation from the central nervous system essentially has an effect on gut function. Parasympathetic innervation is from the vagus nerve. It's always the vagus nerve in the abdomen. And parasympathetic innervation will increase gut activity. Sympathetic innervation is from the sympathetic trunk, right? You've seen the sympathetic trunk. And sympathetic innervation of the GI tract kind of works in opposition, and it slows down activity of the GI tract. So the end of the small bowel is here. This is the start of the large bowel. Let me put the transverse colon back on. Right, so this is where the small bowel ends. This is the ileum, or the ileum, ending at the cecum. The cecum is this blind-ended pouch, the first part of the large intestine. So this is the ileocecal valve. It's a muscular valve, and again, just like at the other end, it pushes stuff from the small bowel into the large bowel. And we'll talk about the large bowel another day. Look, here are the ribs here. So the stomach's very high, it's covered by the ribs partially. There's the liver there, also covered by the ribs. The large bowel then is framing the small bowel. So the enterocytes of the small intestine are also producing a whole bunch of digestive enzymes and helping with digestion, but that's more physiology than anatomy. And also we find, of course, we're talking about an epithelial cell layer here. This is an epithelial layer that has abrasion and stuff going on against it, right? So we're going to lose epithelial cells is my point. So there are also epithelial stem cells. I think most of those are in the crypts, in the intestinal glands. So those epithelial stem cells are then replacing those other cells of the epithelium that are lost. There are a whole bunch of conditions which affect the small intestine and the large intestine. Celiac disease is an intolerance to gluten, so there's an allergic reaction to the gluten in that it causes the immune system to damage the small intestine. And what we see is the villi get a lot shorter and the crypts get a bit longer. So with shorter villi, you're losing a lot of the surface area. So we're losing the ability to absorb as much as we normally would. So you'd see signs of malabsorption, right? So you'd see things like weight loss and diarrhea and steatorrhea. There'd be difficulty absorbing some vitamins. So you'll see some vitamin deficiency conditions. You'll see anemia, but if you can't absorb enough vitamin B12, right, for making the erythrocytes. Okay, but that's about as much as I can think of to talk about the small intestine. We've talked about the general layout, the parts of the duodenum, jejunum and ileum, and why they look different. We've looked at the cells and the histology and the villi and the general layout. We've talked about the changing function through it. So that should do us, right? Small intestine, lovely. Oh, so much better than neuroanatomy. Right, see you next week.